Mark Donovan, a dedicated firefighter and loving father, thought he had the perfect family until he uncovered signs of betrayal that shattered his world. Suspicious of his wife, Olivia's increasingly secretive behavior, Mark's quest for the truth leads him to a shocking discovery about her connection to a charming but dangerous man named Daniel. As Mark dives deeper into Daniel's web of deceit, he uncovers a sinister scheme that threatens not only his marriage but also his family's future. With everything on the line, Mark must confront lies, betrayal, and danger to protect what matters most. But can he prevail? Mark Donovan's world unraveled in 2021. He lived in Riverview, a picturesque town with rolling hills, quaint downtown shops, and a community that thrived on knowing everyone's business. It was the kind of place where the local coffee shop doubled as a gossip hub, and everyone seemed to know your schedule before you did. Mark, a 38-year-old firefighter, was the epitome of what Riverview admired: hard-working, dependable, and fiercely loyal to his family. For over a decade, he'd risked his life for others, earning respect from neighbors and colleagues alike. He was the type of man who always showed up, whether it was a blazing fire or his daughter's school recital. But beneath the surface, Mark's dedication came at a cost. At home, Mark's wife, Olivia, was a picture of grace and warmth. They'd been married for 14 years, sharing a life filled with love, laughter, and the usual ups and downs. Olivia worked part-time at a boutique in town and had a knack for organizing fundraisers for local causes. She was well loved by everyone and known for her infectious smile that seemed to brighten even the darkest days. Then there was their 12-year-old daughter, Emma, Mark's pride and joy. She was a talented artist who often sketched pictures of their family, sticking them on the fridge as if to remind them of the life they'd built together. Mark often joked that Emma had inherited Olivia's charm and his stubbornness, a combination that made her a force to be reckoned with. For years, their life seemed idyllic. Mark worked long hours, but he always found time for his family. He'd surprise Olivia with date nights and help Emma with her school projects. To anyone looking in from the outside, the Donovans were the perfect family, but cracks began to form in their seemingly perfect life. It started with little things: missed calls, unexplained errands, and Olivia growing distant. Mark brushed it off at first, chalking it up to the stress of balancing work and family. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, Mark came home early from his shift. His crew had wrapped up a minor call, and he decided to surprise Olivia with takeout from her favorite restaurant. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed an unfamiliar car parked in front of their house, a sleek black sedan, polished to perfection, its presence out of place in their modest neighborhood. Stepping inside, he was met with an eerie silence. No TV in the background, no Emma singing along to her favorite songs. He called out for Olivia but received no response. His heart raced as he made his way through the house, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the living room, he found Olivia sitting on the couch, her back turned to him, and a man he didn't recognize sitting across from her. The man looked up first, his expression calm, yet calculating. Olivia turned next, startled but quickly masking it with a forced smile. "Mark, you're home early," she said, her voice a little too cheerful. Mark forced a smile, though his mind was spinning. "Yeah, finished up early, thought I'd bring dinner." The man stood, extending a hand. "Hi, I'm Daniel, Olivia's business partner." Mark hesitated, but shook his hand, noting the firm grip and polished demeanor. Daniel was sharply dressed, exuding the kind of confidence that made Mark instantly uneasy. "Business partner? Since when?" Mark asked, trying to keep his tone light. Olivia laughed nervously. "Oh, I must have forgotten to mention it. Daniel's helping with the boutique expansion. We've been brainstorming ideas." Mark nodded slowly, though something about the situation didn't sit right. He excused himself to the kitchen, watching through the doorway as Olivia and Daniel continued their conversation, their voices too low to make out. A wave of unease settled over him. Who was this man? And why hadn't Olivia mentioned him before? Over the next few weeks, Daniel's name began to pop up more frequently. Olivia mentioned meetings, phone calls, and trips to the city for work. Mark tried to suppress his growing doubts, telling himself he was overthinking, but the distance between him and Olivia only seemed to grow. Late one night, after Olivia had gone to bed, Mark sat in the living room, scrolling through old photos on his phone. Pictures of vacations, holidays, and everyday moments filled the screen, each one a reminder of the life they'd built. He glanced toward the stairs, wondering if they could ever get back to the way things were. It wasn't until he found a receipt in Olivia's purse that his suspicions deepened. She had left her bag on the counter, and as Mark reached for his keys, the edge of the receipt caught his eye. It was for a dinner at an upscale restaurant in the city, one he knew Olivia would never go to alone. The date matched a night she had claimed to be working late. Mark's chest tightened as he folded the receipt and slipped it into his pocket. He couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Something was going on, and he needed to find out what. But he also knew that once he opened this door, there would be no going back. The next morning, Mark decided to confront Olivia. As she prepared Emma's lunch, he leaned against the kitchen counter, watching her every move. "Olivia," he began, his voice steady. "I found this." He held up the receipt, his gaze locked on hers. Olivia froze, her hands gripping the countertop. For a moment, she didn't say anything, her expression unreadable. Then she forced a laugh, though it lacked her usual warmth. "Oh, that it was a work dinner with Daniel. I didn't think it was important." Mark studied her face, searching for any sign of truth. "Work dinner? You didn't mention it." "I must have forgotten. Things have been so busy lately," she said quickly, avoiding his gaze. Mark nodded, though his instincts told him there was more to the story. But rather than press further, he decided to bide his time. If there was one thing his years as a firefighter had taught him, it was the importance of patience. The truth always came to light eventually. As Olivia left for another meeting that afternoon, Mark watched her drive away, his mind racing. Something was wrong, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. Little did he know, the journey he was about to embark on would uncover secrets that would shatter the very foundation of his life. Mark spent the next few days in a haze of suspicion. He couldn't shake the feeling that Olivia's explanations didn't add up. Her late nights, the mysterious dinners, and that black sedan, it all pointed to something more. He just wasn't sure what. The doubts gnawed at him, stealing his focus at work and leaving him restless at home. But Mark wasn't a man to act on impulse. Instead of confronting Olivia again, he decided to dig deeper. He started with the basics, keeping an eye on her schedule, noting the times she left and returned. Her phone calls became another clue. She often left the room to take them, her voice lowered to a whisper. One night, curiosity got the better of him. Olivia had fallen asleep on the couch, her phone clutched loosely in her hand. Mark hesitated, staring at the device as if it were a coiled snake. After a moment, he gently pried it from her grasp and unlocked it. His heart raced as he scrolled through her messages. Most of them were innocent exchanges with friends and colleagues, until he found Daniel's name. Their conversation was buried under a sea of chats, but once Mark opened it, the pieces started falling into place. Daniel had been texting Olivia regularly, and their messages went far beyond work. Mark's chest tightened as he read through the exchanges, each one more damning than the last. "Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you. You looked stunning in that dress. Wish I could have stayed longer. Looking forward to our getaway. Just a few more days." Mark's hands shook as he put the phone down. He felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. For years, he'd poured every ounce of himself into their marriage, sacrificing time, energy, and even his own happiness to make their life together work. And this was how Olivia repaid him. But it wasn't just about Olivia. What about Emma? The thought of their daughter being caught in the middle of this mess was almost too much to bear. Mark knew he had to confront Olivia, but he wanted to do it on his terms. He needed more than just text messages. He needed undeniable proof. The next morning, Mark called his friend and colleague, Tom. Tom was the kind of guy who always knew someone who could help with unconventional problems. After hearing Mark's situation, Tom didn't hesitate. "I've got a guy," he said. "He's discreet and good at what he does." That's how Mark found himself sitting in a dimly lit office later that afternoon, talking to a private investigator named Ray. Ray was a no-nonsense type, with a grizzled demeanor and a knack for finding the truth. You want surveillance? Ray asked, scribbling notes on a pad. Cameras, trackers, the works? Mark nodded. I need to know everything. Where she's going, who she's meeting. I can't confront her without proof. Ray leaned back in his chair, studying Mark for a moment. You sure about this? Once you start down this road, there's no turning back. Mark hesitated, but only for a moment. I need to protect my daughter. If Olivia's making choices that could hurt Emma, I need to know. Within days, Ray had set up a discreet surveillance system around the Donovan home. Cameras covered the front door, driveway, and living room, while a GPS tracker was discreetly placed on Olivia's car. Mark felt a pang of guilt as he watched Ray work, but he reminded himself that he wasn't the one breaking vows. The first few days of surveillance yielded little. Olivia stuck to her usual routine: school drop-offs, work at the boutique, and the occasional trip to the grocery store. But on the third day, things took a turn. Olivia told Mark she'd be working late again, claiming the boutique was preparing for a big sale. She left shortly after dinner, dressed in a way that didn't quite match her work story. Mark watched the tracker as her car left town and headed toward the city. He felt a knot form in his stomach when the signal stopped at an upscale hotel. He waited, staring at the screen for over an hour until the tracker showed her car moving again, this time to a restaurant downtown. When she finally came home, it was nearly midnight. She slipped into bed without a word, and Mark lay beside her, seething in silence. The next morning, Mark received the first batch of footage from Ray. It was worse than he'd imagined. The camera outside their house had caught Olivia leaving with Daniel earlier that evening. They got into his car, laughing and holding hands like a couple of teenagers. Later, the footage showed them returning, Olivia's hair slightly disheveled, Daniel's hand lingering on her waist as they said their goodbyes. Mark couldn't watch anymore. He turned off the video, his heart pounding with anger and betrayal. This wasn't just a mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was a deliberate choice. Olivia had been living a double life, and now, Mark had the proof to confront her. That evening, Mark waited until Emma was asleep before pulling Olivia aside. She looked surprised, but didn't seem alarmed. "What's going on?" she asked, setting down her tea. Mark took a deep breath, his voice steady but cold. "I know about Daniel. I know about the dinners, the hotel, the lies." Olivia's face went pale, her hands trembling slightly. "Mark, it's not what you think." "Don't," he interrupted. "Don't insult me by lying again. I've seen the footage, I've read the messages, I know everything." For a moment, Olivia didn't say anything. Then, as if a switch flipped, her expression changed. "You were spying on me?" she snapped, her voice rising. "That's how little you trust me?" Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Trust you? You've been sneaking around with another man, and you want to talk about trust?" Olivia opened her mouth to argue, but stopped herself. She looked down, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you." Mark's jaw tightened. "Then why, after everything we've been through, why would you do this?" Olivia wiped her eyes, her voice shaky. "I don't know, I felt lost. You're always working, always busy. I felt like I didn't matter anymore." Mark's anger flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. "So instead of talking to me, you turned to someone else. You brought him into our home, into our lives?" Olivia didn't respond, and the silence between them was deafening. Mark felt a pang of sorrow as he looked at her. The woman he'd loved for so many years, now a stranger to him. "I can't do this," he said finally. "Not for me, and not for Emma. If you want to fix this, you need to be honest. Otherwise, we're done." Olivia looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "Mark, please." "It's not up to me anymore," he said, his voice firm. "It's up to you." The room fell silent as Mark walked away, leaving Olivia alone with her thoughts. For the first time, he felt like he was in control of his life again. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't let betrayal define him or his family. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If this story has kept you hooked so far, it's only getting more intense from here. Mark's ultimatum had shaken Olivia, but it was clear that she wasn't ready to let go of her secrets. For the next few days, the house was heavy with tension. Conversations were brief, mostly revolving around Emma, and any mention of Daniel or the betrayal sent Olivia into defensive silence. Mark, however, wasn't about to let things slide. While Olivia seemed to be retreating into herself, Mark was quietly planning his next steps. He wasn't just looking for closure, he was determined to protect his daughter from the fallout and ensure that Daniel didn't have a foothold in their lives. Mark called Ray again, this time with a more specific request. "I need to know who Daniel really is," he said. "If he's doing this to my family, I want to know how many others he's hurt." Ray didn't hesitate. "I'll dig deeper. Guys like him usually have skeletons in the closet. I'll let you know what I find." It didn't take long for Ray to deliver. When Mark received the report, it was worse than he imagined. Daniel wasn't just a charming businessman, he had a long history of affairs with married women, many of whom ended up financially ruined or emotionally devastated. There were whispers of lawsuits, suspicious business deals, and even a quiet settlement involving another family he'd destroyed. But the most damning detail: Daniel had been leveraging his relationships to gain access to his partner's assets. He would cozy up to them, gain their trust, and then manipulate them into financial decisions that benefited him. Once he got what he wanted, he moved on, leaving a trail of chaos in his wake. Armed with this information, Mark realized this wasn't just a personal betrayal. Daniel was a predator, and Olivia was his latest target. That evening, Mark confronted Olivia again, this time with the evidence in hand. She was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone, when he placed the folder on the coffee table in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, her voice wary. "Open it," Mark said, his tone firm. Olivia hesitated, but eventually flipped through the pages as she read, her face paled. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That doesn't matter," Mark replied. "What matters is that this is who you've been spending your time with. This is the man you've brought into our lives." Olivia looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "Mark, I didn't know." "Didn't know?" Mark's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "You didn't think to ask, to question why he was so interested in you, why he was suddenly part of your life. You didn't see the pattern?" Olivia buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "I made a mistake. I was stupid. I thought—" She stopped, struggling to find the words. "I thought he cared." Mark shook his head, his anger giving way to disappointment. "He doesn't care, Olivia. He never cared. He's been using you, just like he's used everyone else. And now, he's put our entire family at risk." Olivia's tears didn't move him. This wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about taking control of a situation that had spiraled too far out of hand. "You need to end this," Mark said, his voice cold and final. "Completely. No calls, no meetings, no excuses. If I even suspect you're still in contact with him, I'll make sure everyone in this town knows who he really is." Olivia nodded through her tears, but Mark wasn't convinced he'd seen her lie before, and he wasn't going to rely on her promises this time. The next day, Mark decided to take matters into his own hands. He drove to Daniel's office, a sleek, modern building in the city. He wasn't sure what he planned to do: confront him, threaten him, maybe even expose him. All he knew was that he needed to send a message. When Mark entered the lobby, the receptionist gave him a polite but wary smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Daniel," Mark said, his voice calm but firm. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No," Mark replied, "but I think he'll want to see me." Before she could respond, the elevator doors opened, and Daniel stepped out, his expression shifting from surprise to something that almost looked like amusement. "Mark Donovan," Daniel said, striding over with that same smug confidence that made Mark's blood boil. "This is unexpected." Mark didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We need to talk now." Daniel raised an eyebrow, but gestured toward his office. "Of course, right this way." The office was as sleek and polished as the man himself, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the city, but Mark wasn't there to admire the scenery. "Let's cut to the chase," Mark said, turning to face Daniel. "I know who you are. I know what you've done." Daniel's smile didn't falter. "And what exactly do you think you know?" Mark stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "I know about the affairs, the settlements, The families you've destroyed. I know how you manipulate women, how you use them to get what you want." Daniel's smile finally faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You've been doing your homework." "Damn right I have," Mark snapped. "And now I'm here to tell you that it stops. You stay away from my wife, my family, and my town, or I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are." Daniel chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down Mark's spine. "You think you can scare me? You're just a small-town firefighter. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Mark clenched his fists, every muscle in his body screaming for him to throw a punch, but he held back, knowing that would only give Daniel more ammunition. "I may be a small-town firefighter," Mark said, his voice steady, "but I'm also a husband and a father, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect my family. You've been warned." Without waiting for a response, Mark turned and walked out, his heart pounding. He didn't know if his words had made an impact, but he didn't care. He'd said what he needed to say, and now it was up to Daniel to make the next move. When Mark returned home, he found Olivia sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of guilt and relief. "I ended it," she said quietly. "I told him it was over." Mark nodded, though he wasn't ready to trust her just yet. "Good. But I'm warning you, Olivia. If I find out you've lied to me again, there won't be a second chance." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I just want to fix this, Mark. I want us to be a family again." Mark didn't respond. He wanted to believe her, but the damage had been done. Trust would take time to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. In the weeks that followed, Olivia seemed to be making an effort. She was more present with Emma, more attentive to Mark, and noticeably distant from her phone. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Despite Olivia's promise to end things, Mark couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in his chest. There was something about her sudden willingness to comply, the way she avoided any mention of Daniel, that felt too rehearsed. Mark knew better than to let his guard down. He had seen too many fires reignite after seeming extinguished. Determined to get closure, he decided to keep the surveillance active, just in case Ray had been hesitant to continue the operation, warning Mark about the emotional toll it could take. But Mark was resolute. He needed the truth, no matter how painful. One night, as Mark reviewed the day's footage, his heart sank. Olivia had gone to the boutique in the morning as usual, but around noon, she left abruptly, driving toward the city. Mark leaned forward, dread pooling in his stomach as the tracker showed her car stopping at a familiar location. The same hotel she had visited weeks earlier. His pulse quickened as he switched to the live feed from the tracker. He watched her car idle in the parking lot before Daniel's black sedan pulled in beside her. Olivia got out, glancing around nervously, and climbed into Daniel's car. Within moments, they drove off together. Mark's hands trembled as he closed the laptop. He'd given her the chance to come clean, to rebuild the trust she'd shattered, and she had thrown it all away. But instead of anger, Mark felt a strange sense of calm. The kind of calm that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done. The next morning, Mark met with Ray at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town. He slid a flash drive across the table. "This has everything. Locations, footage, even audio of their conversations," Mark said, his voice steady but cold. Ray raised an eyebrow. "What's your plan?" Mark leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I'm not going to confront her again. Not yet. I need to know what Daniel's endgame is. If he thinks I'm out of the picture, he'll get sloppy." Ray nodded, slipping the flash drive into his pocket. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mark." "I don't have a choice," Mark replied. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about Emma, our home, our future. If Daniel thinks he can destroy that, he's got another thing coming." For the next week, Mark played the part of the oblivious husband. He didn't mention Olivia's trip to the city or the hours she'd spent with Daniel. Instead, he focused on Emma, helping her with her art projects and making sure she felt secure amid the chaos. But behind the scenes, Mark was gathering everything he needed to expose Daniel for who he really was. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening. Ray called, his tone urgent. "You're not going to believe this. Daniel's been siphoning money from Olivia's boutique. He's been using her accounts to funnel cash into his shell companies." Mark gripped the phone tighter. "Does she know?" "Hard to say," Ray replied. But if she doesn't, she's going to find out soon. One of the employees noticed discrepancies in the payroll and flagged it to the bank. If this gets out, Olivia could be held accountable. Mark closed his eyes, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Send me everything you have. When the files arrived later that night, Mark felt a grim sense of vindication. The evidence was damning. Bank transfers, altered invoices, and forged signatures. Daniel had been setting Olivia up as the fall person for his scheme, just as he'd done to others before her. But this time, Daniel had underestimated his opponent. Mark's first move was to confront Olivia's business partner, Carla. She had been Olivia's friend for years and had always been wary of Daniel. When Mark showed her the evidence, Carla's jaw tightened. I knew something was off about him, she said, pacing the room. But Olivia wouldn't listen. She said he was helping us expand, bringing in investors. Mark shook his head. He's not helping anyone but himself. If we don't act now, Olivia's going to take the fall for this. Carla stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing. What do you need me to do? Contact the bank, Mark said. Tell them to freeze the accounts. We need to stop this before it gets any worse. Carla nodded. Determination etched across her face. Consider it done. With Carla's help, Mark began piecing together a plan to expose Daniel. But he knew that confronting Olivia would be inevitable. She deserved to know the truth, even if it shattered what little remained of their relationship. That moment came sooner than Mark expected. Late one night, after Emma had gone to bed, Olivia walked into the living room, her face pale and drawn. Mark, she said quietly. I need to talk to you. Mark set down the paperwork he'd been reviewing and gestured for her to sit. What is it? She hesitated, her hands trembling. Carla called me today. She said there's been an issue with the boutique's accounts. Mark's expression remained neutral. What kind of issue? Olivia's voice cracked. She thinks Daniel's been stealing from us. She says there's evidence, bank records, forged signatures, but I don't understand. He told me he was helping. Mark leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Helping Olivia, he's been using you. He's been using your business, your trust, to cover his tracks. Tears streamed down her face. I didn't know, I swear, I didn't know. Mark's voice softened, but his resolve didn't waver. You should have known, Olivia. You let him into our lives, our home. You chose to believe him over me, and now look where it's gotten us. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. What do we do? How do we fix this? Mark stood, his tone firm. We expose him. We take the evidence to the authorities and make sure he can't do this to anyone else. But make no mistake, Olivia. This isn't just about Daniel, it's about us. And I don't know if we can come back from this. Olivia looked up at him, desperation in her eyes. I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. Just tell me what to do. Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned and walked toward the stairs, leaving Olivia alone with her guilt. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he felt like he had control over his life again. As the pieces of their plan began to fall into place, Mark prepared himself for the final confrontation. Daniel had been playing games for far too long. But this time, the rules were about to change. Mark had spent weeks preparing for this moment, meticulously gathering evidence, coordinating with Carla, and setting a trap that Daniel wouldn't see coming. The stakes had never been higher. Daniel wasn't just a threat to Mark's marriage. He was a threat to everything Mark had worked so hard to build, including his family's future. The day of reckoning began with a meeting at the boutique. Mark and Carla sat in the back office, surrounded by stacks of documents that detailed every fraudulent transaction. Olivia was there too, pale and visibly shaken, but determined to face the truth. For the first time, she seemed fully aware of the consequences of her choices. We have everything we need, Carla said, pointing to a highlighted section on one of the printouts. The forged signatures, the bank transfers, this is airtight. Mark nodded. It's time to go to the police. But first, we need to confront Daniel. I want him to know he's not getting away with this. Olivia looked up, her voice trembling. Are you sure that's a good idea? He's dangerous. Mark's gaze hardened. That's exactly why we need to do this. If we stay silent, he'll just move on to his next victim. Carla crossed her arms. We'll do it together. Strength in numbers. Mark called Ray, who had been monitoring Daniel's movements for weeks. "He's at the club," Ray said. "Same spot he always uses for his shady meetings." Mark felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The moment to take back control. The three of them, Mark, Olivia, and Carla, arrived at the upscale country club an hour later. The valet barely glanced at them as they entered the grand lobby, their determination masked by calm exteriors. Mark knew exactly where to go. Ray had shared the layout, pointing out the private dining room Daniel favored for his clandestine deals. As they approached the room, they could hear voices. Mark pushed the door open without hesitation, his presence commanding the attention of everyone inside. Daniel looked up from his seat at the head of the table, a smirk forming on his face when he saw Mark. "Well, this is unexpected," Daniel said, leaning back in his chair with an air of arrogance. "What can I do for you, Mark?" Mark took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. "You can start by explaining why you've been stealing from my wife's business." Daniel's smirk faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "Stealing? That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof? Or is this just a desperate attempt to blame someone else for your problems?" Carla stepped forward, holding up a folder. "We have plenty of proof: bank statements, forged documents, even audio recordings of your meetings. You're done, Daniel." Daniel's expression darkened. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said, his voice low and menacing. Mark didn't flinch. "Neither do you." The tension in the room was palpable. Daniel's calm demeanor was slipping, and Mark knew he had the upper hand. But before Daniel could respond, Olivia spoke up. "I trusted you," she said, her voice breaking. "I believed you when you said you wanted to help, and now I find out you've been using me, using my business to cover your tracks." Daniel turned to her, his tone suddenly soft and condescending. "Olivia, you're being emotional. You don't understand how these things work." "Don't you dare!" Olivia snapped, her anger boiling over. "I may have been blind, but I'm not stupid. You lied to me, manipulated me, and almost destroyed everything I've worked for. You're a fraud, Daniel, and we're not going to let you get away with it." Mark felt a surge of pride as he watched Olivia stand up to Daniel. For the first time in weeks, she seemed like the woman he'd fallen in love with, strong, determined, and unwilling to back down. Daniel stood, his facade of control finally cracking. "You think you can take me down? You're nobody, all of you." Mark stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "We don't have to take you down, Daniel. You've already done that to yourself. The police will be very interested in what we've uncovered. I'd start packing if I were you." Daniel glared at them, his jaw clenched. For a moment, it looked like he might lash out, but instead, he grabbed his briefcase and stormed out of the room. As the door slammed shut, Carla let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Well, that was intense. Mark turned to Olivia, who looked both relieved and exhausted. "It's not over yet," he said. "We still need to take this to the authorities." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, police officers, and financial investigators. The evidence against Daniel was overwhelming, and it didn't take long for law enforcement to act. Within a week, Daniel was arrested on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. His empire crumbled, and his victims began to come forward, grateful that someone had finally stood up to him. For Mark, the victory was bittersweet. While he was relieved to see Daniel brought to justice, he knew the battle had taken a toll on his family. Olivia was trying to make amends, but trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. Mark wasn't sure if their marriage could survive, but he was willing to try, for Emma's sake, if nothing else. One evening, as Mark sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, Olivia joined him. She looked nervous, twisting her hands in her lap. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said quietly, "for not giving up on me, on us." Mark sighed, staring out at the horizon. "I didn't do it for us, I did it for Emma. She deserves better than this." Olivia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know. And I want to be better. For her. For you." Mark didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure if he was ready to forgive, but he knew they couldn't move forward without trying. "We'll see," he said finally. "One day at a time." As the sun set, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like they might actually make it through together. In the aftermath of Daniel's arrest, Life for the Donovans slowly began to settle into a new normal. The town buzzed with news of the scandal, and while Mark avoided the gossip, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction, knowing Daniel's schemes had been exposed. It wasn't just about justice, it was about reclaiming the life Daniel had tried to destroy. For Olivia, the fallout was more personal. She had to face not only the financial mess Daniel had left behind, but also the damage she had done to her family. The boutique survived thanks to Carla, who worked tirelessly to reassure clients and clean up the books. Olivia threw herself into rebuilding the business, using it as a way to prove to Mark and herself that she could make things right. At home, Olivia made a point to be present, for Emma and for Mark. She no longer hid behind excuses or avoided hard conversations. Instead, she faced the reality of her choices head-on. There were nights when the silence between her and Mark felt unbearable, but she didn't let it deter her. Little by little, she tried to earn back his trust. Mark, however, struggled to let go of the betrayal. He had spent so much time focusing on protecting his family that he hadn't allowed himself to process his own emotions. The anger, hurt, and disappointment weighed heavily on him, but he wasn't ready to give up. For Emma's sake, he decided to keep moving forward, even if it was one small step at a time. One evening, Mark found himself in the garage, tinkering with an old project car he hadn't touched in years. The sound of the tools and the familiar scent of motor oil brought him a sense of calm he hadn't felt in weeks. As he worked, Emma came in, holding a sketch pad. "Dad," she said, sitting on a stool nearby, "I made something for you." Mark wiped his hands on a rag and turned to her. "What is it?" Emma hesitated before handing him the sketch pad. It was a drawing of their family. Him, Olivia and Emma, standing together in front of their house. Beneath the picture she had written, "Family means sticking together, no matter what." Mark's throat tightened as he looked at the drawing. He pulled Emma into a hug, holding her close. "Thank you, sweetheart. This means a lot." Emma looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. "Yeah, we'll be okay. It's just gonna take some time." The drawing ended up on the fridge, a small but powerful reminder of what they were fighting for. Slowly, Mark began to open up. He and Olivia started going to counseling, where they worked through the layers of pain and mistrust. The sessions weren't easy. There were tears, arguments, and moments where it felt like they weren't making any progress. But there were also breakthroughs, moments where they remembered why they fell in love in the first place. One of the biggest challenges was learning to communicate again. For years, they had fallen into a pattern of avoidance, Mark throwing himself into work, Olivia hiding behind her duties at home. Counseling forced them to confront those patterns and find healthier ways to connect. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Emma became a source of inspiration for both of them. Her resilience and optimism reminded Mark and Olivia of what really mattered. They made a pact to prioritize their family, setting aside regular time for game nights, movie marathons, and outings to Emma's favorite art supply store. These moments, though small, began to rebuild the foundation of their relationship. As for Daniel, his downfall was swift and absolute. The charges against him were extensive, and with the evidence Mark and Carla had provided, his conviction was almost guaranteed. Other victims came forward, and Daniel's reputation was left in ruins. For Mark, knowing that Daniel could no longer hurt anyone else was a victory in itself. Months passed, and the wounds began to heal. Mark and Olivia were far from perfect, but they were learning to forgive, not just each other, but also themselves. Olivia forgave herself for her mistakes, while Mark forgave himself for the years he had spent ignoring the cracks in their marriage. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. On a crisp autumn morning, the family stood together in their backyard, watching as Emma proudly displayed her latest art project. It was a mural she had painted on the back fence, depicting a sunrise over a field of flowers. In the corner, she had painted their family, standing together under the bright sky. "It's beautiful," Olivia said, her voice filled with emotion. Emma beamed. "It's about new beginnings like us." Mark wrapped an arm around Emma's shoulders, pulling her close. "It's perfect." As they stood there, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time, he believed they could face them together. They weren't the same family they had been before Daniel entered their lives, but maybe that was okay. They were stronger now, more honest, and more determined to protect what mattered most. And so, the Donovans began a new chapter, not defined by betrayal, but by resilience, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bond of family. Thank you for joining us for this incredible journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We have more gripping tales coming your way, and we can't wait to share them with you. See you next time.